Let's get something straight from the beginning. If you're trying to force connection with someone avoidant by doubling your messages, over-explaining your feelings, or trying to prove your worth, you're not creating attraction. You're activating their withdrawal system. Avoidant individuals don't pull away because they don't feel. They pull away because closeness feels overwhelming when it comes too fast, too intense, or too emotionally demanding. So what actually works? Not silence as punishment, not chasing as desperation, but something far more powerful. Soft contact. Soft contact is the ability to stay emotionally warm without being emotionally invasive. It sounds simple, but most people get it wrong. They either disappear completely, hoping absence creates longing, or they stay overly present, hoping consistency creates attachment. But both extremes create imbalance. Soft contact sits in the middle. It says, I'm open to connection, but I'm not attached to outcome. When you send a message, it's calm, no emotional pressure, no hidden agenda, just presence. When you don't get a reply, you don't spiral. You don't follow up 5 times. You simply continue your life. And this is where something interesting happens psychologically. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but also highly sensitive to emotional stability. When they experience you as steady, grounded, and not chasing them for regulation, their nervous system begins to recalibrate. You stop feeling like pressure, and you start feeling like peace. But here's the part most people misunderstand. Soft contact is not a strategy to get someone back. It is a reflection of emotional maturity. Because if someone only comes back when you stop chasing them, what they are responding to is not your loss, but your balance. And that tells you everything you need to know about the relationship dynamic. At the same time, soft contact protects you because it forces you to stop abandoning yourself in the name of connection. You no longer overtext to feel secure. You no longer interpret silence as rejection. You no longer inflate your worth based on their responsiveness. Instead, you become anchored. And ironically, that anchoring is what creates attraction again. Not because you are trying to pull them in, but because you are no longer collapsing when they pull away. Avoidants don't respond the way many people expect in relationships. When emotions get intense, when expectations rise, when messages become frequent or loaded with meaning, something inside them doesn't lean in, it pulls back. Not because they don't care, and not because they are cold, but because their nervous system associates emotional pressure with loss of autonomy. And for them, autonomy feels like safety. So when someone tries harder, texts more, explains more, seeks reassurance more, it often creates the opposite effect of what was intended. Instead of feeling closer, the avoidant begins to feel a quiet internal need to create distance. It's not a conscious decision like I don't want this person. It's more like an automatic emotional reflex that says this is getting too intense too fast. I need space to regulate myself. What many people misunderstand is that avoidants are not avoiding connection itself. They are avoiding the experience of being emotionally overwhelmed inside connection. If closeness feels like demand, expectation, or emotional urgency, their system interprets that as pressure. And pressure for them is not neutral. It is triggering. But something very important happens when the emotional environment changes. When the tone becomes calm instead of urgent. When communication feels open instead of demanding. When presence is steady instead of chasing, the avoidant nervous system begins to settle. They are not scanning for escape anymore. They are not bracing for emotional escalation. Instead, they start to experience something unfamiliar in high-intensity dynamics, emotional safety. Emotional safety is not about perfection or walking on eggshells. It is about predictability without pressure. It is about knowing that connection exists without feeling forced into constant emotional output. When someone feels they can breathe in a relationship, when they are not being pulled, questioned, or emotionally cornered, they begin to relax. And relaxation is the doorway that closeness requires. Space plays an equally important role. To many people, giving space feels like risk. It feels like losing control of the connection. But for an avoidant, space is not absence, it is regulation. It is where they reconnect with themselves without feeling emotionally flooded. And when they return from that space, and the relationship is still calm, still stable, still non-demanding, something begins to shift internally. They don't feel chased. They don't feel pressured. They feel met. This is where connection becomes possible again, not through persuasion, but through emotional recalibration. The avoidant begins to associate you with something different, not intensity pursuit, not emotional urgency, but steadiness. and steadiness is rare in their experience of closeness, which makes it quietly powerful. But it's important to understand that emotional safety cannot be faked or used as a tactic. If space is given with resentment, if calmness is used as manipulation, or if silence is used as punishment, the dynamic collapses again. Avoidants are sensitive not just to pressure, but also to inauthenticity in emotional tone. True emotional safety comes from regulation within yourself. It comes from not over-investing in immediate responses, not tying your self-worth to attention, and not turning connection into a constant negotiation. When you are internally stable, your communication naturally becomes lighter, clearer, and less demanding. And that changes everything. Because at that point, the avoidant is no longer responding to pressure. They're responding to the absence of it. They're responding to the feeling that they are not being pulled into something overwhelming. And in that space, curiosity can return. Trust can rebuild. Connection can re-emerge slowly without force. But the deeper truth is this. Emotional safety and space do not just influence avoidance. They reveal the quality of the connection itself. If the bond strengthens only when pressure is removed, then what is being revealed is not control, but compatibility with calmness. And that is something both people eventually have to understand clearly. Reconnection in emotionally complex dynamics does not usually happen because one person tries harder, explains more, or increases emotional intensity. In fact, for many people, especially those who lean avoidant in attachment, those behaviors often have the opposite effect. They create more distance, not less. This is because emotional chasing is experienced internally as pressure, and pressure rarely leads to openness. It leads to withdrawal. When someone feels the need to constantly pursue, clarify, or secure reassurance, the energy of the interaction shifts. It stops feeling like mutual connection and starts feeling like emotional pursuit. Even if the intention is love, care, or clarity, the nervous system on the receiving end may register it as demand. And when emotional demand increases, the natural instinct for someone who is sensitive to closeness is to step back and regain equilibrium. This is why reconnection rarely comes from escalation. It comes from the absence of it. When emotional chasing is removed, something important changes in the relational field. The space that was previously filled with urgency, repeated messages, or emotional pressure becomes quieter. That quietness is not emptiness. It is room for perception. It allows both people to feel the relationship without the constant noise of pursuit or defense. In that space, the avoidance system begins to recalibrate. Instead of reacting to intensity, it starts observing consistency. Instead of feeling pursued, it begins to notice presence without demand. And this subtle shift matters more than most people realize. Because avoidant individuals are not typically drawn back by intensity. They are drawn back by emotional neutrality that feels safe enough to re-enter. Meanwhile, the person who steps back from chasing often undergoes their own transformation. The emotional system that was previously focused outward, checking responses, interpreting silence, trying to maintain connection, begins to return inward. This shift is crucial. It restores balance. It reduces emotional dependency. It allows clarity to emerge where anxiety used to dominate. And paradoxically, this is where reconnection becomes possible. Not because distance alone creates attraction, but because the removal of pressure restores choice. When someone no longer feels emotionally pursued, they are no longer operating from the need to escape. They are free to evaluate the connection without the weight of expectation pressing on them. And in that state, curiosity can reappear. Curiosity is often the first real doorway back into connection. It is quiet. It is not driven by obligation or guilt. It emerges when the emotional environment feels different enough from past experiences that re-engagement no longer feels overwhelming. In this way, the absence of chasing creates a psychological contrast. The relationship is no longer associated with pressure, and so it becomes emotionally accessible again. However, it is important to understand that removing emotional chasing is not a strategy to trigger a response. When used as a tactic, it loses its grounding and becomes another form of control. True non-chasing behavior is not about manipulating distance to produce return. It is about regulating your own emotional state so that your actions are no longer driven by urgency. When a person stops chasing, not from suppression but from internal stability, their communication naturally changes. Messages become less loaded. Silence becomes less threatening. Responses are no longer demanded but received. This creates a completely different emotional atmosphere, one that is no longer saturated with pressure. And in that atmosphere, Reconnection can happen organically if it is going to happen at all. The dynamic is no longer fueled by pursuit versus retreat. Instead, it becomes a space where both people can choose presence without feeling cornered into it. The deeper truth is that emotional chasing rarely builds lasting connection because it is rooted in fear of loss rather than grounded presence. When fear leads, connection becomes unstable. But when fear is reduced, the system that once resisted closeness no longer needs to defend against it. And in that reduced tension, reconnection becomes not something forced, but something that can finally be felt again with clarity. Soft contact is often misunderstood, especially in modern dating advice, where people try to turn emotional dynamics into strategies. But at its core, soft contact is not a tactic, and it is definitely not emotional withdrawal used to trigger a reaction. It is a state of calm relational presence, where you remain open, steady, and respectful without slipping into emotional urgency or disappearing as a form of control. The difference may seem subtle on the surface, but psychologically it is very significant. Emotional withdrawal games are driven by an agenda. They are designed, consciously or unconsciously, to create uncertainty in the other person, so they respond, chase, or re-engage. There is tension in it, there is calculation in it. Even if no words are spoken, the energy behind it is reactive. It comes from a place of trying to regain power, attention, or validation by removing yourself in a way that creates discomfort for the other person. Soft contact is the opposite of that inner state. Soft contact is when you stay emotionally grounded regardless of the other person's level of engagement. You are not overextending yourself to keep connection alive, but you are also not disappearing to provoke a reaction. Instead, you maintain a steady, low-pressure presence that communicates, I am here, I am okay, and I am not in emotional panic. This matters because people, especially those sensitive to emotional intensity, can feel the difference between pressure and presence. Even without explicit communication, the tone of your interaction carries emotional signals. When someone senses urgency, neediness, or hidden expectations, they often become guarded. But when they sense calmness without emotional demand, their system can relax. Soft contact creates that relaxation. It allows space without turning that space into punishment. It allows distance without turning that distance into manipulation. It allows communication without loading every message with emotional weight. In this way, it preserves connection without forcing it into constant engagement. Many people struggle with this balance because their nervous system associates silence with loss. So when they step back, they do so with emotional intensity, either by cutting off completely or by waiting in anxious anticipation for a response. Both extremes are emotionally charged, both are reactive, and both can destabilize connection rather than support it. Soft contact avoids those extremes. It is not about disappearing. It is about not over-inserting yourself. It is not about testing the other person. It is about regulating yourself so that your presence is not driven by fear of abandonment or fear of rejection. When your internal state is stable, your external behavior naturally becomes softer, clearer, and less reactive. This creates an important psychological effect in relationships. The other person no longer experiences you as a source of emotional pressure or unpredictability. Instead, you become associated with steadiness. And steadiness is what allows trust to rebuild over time, especially in dynamics where emotional intensity previously created distance. However, soft contact is not passive. It still involves boundaries. It still involves discernment. You are not endlessly available, and you are not ignoring your own emotional needs. The key difference is that your boundaries are not enforced through emotional games. They are expressed through clarity and consistency. For example, instead of disappearing to make someone miss you, you naturally reduce engagement because you are not over-investing in a dynamic that lacks reciprocity. Instead of over-texting to keep connection alive, you respond when it feels natural, not when anxiety demands it. Instead of using silence as punishment, you use space as regulation. This is what makes soft contact powerful. It is emotionally honest. It does not attempt to control the other person's response. It focuses on regulating your own. And when you stop trying to manage the emotional reactions of others, your energy becomes more stable and less reactive, which often changes how others perceive and respond to you. But the most important aspect is this. Soft contact is not about getting someone back or keeping someone interested. It is about ensuring that your way of relating does not cost you your emotional stability. It is about staying connected to yourself while remaining open to connection with others. When practiced correctly, It removes desperation from communication. It removes hidden agendas from distance. And it removes emotional volatility from interaction. What remains is something much simpler and more grounded. Calm presence that does not force, does not chase, and does not manipulate, but also does not disappear into emotional absence. That balance is what makes soft contact not a game, but a healthier way of relating altogether. In emotional communication, especially in romantic dynamics, people often focus heavily on what is being said. They carefully choose the right words, the right explanations, and the right logic to convince, persuade, or reassure the other person. But in reality, the human nervous system responds far more to how something is said than to the actual content of the message. Tone carries emotional information that words alone cannot fully control. It reveals intention, internal state, and emotional stability in a way language often fails to hide. When someone speaks or texts from a place of neediness, even if the words are loving or reasonable, the underlying energy is still detectable. Neediness is not always obvious in vocabulary. It shows up in urgency, repetition, over-explaining, or subtle pressure for reassurance. It creates an emotional weight in communication that the other person can feel. And when that weight is present, it often shifts the dynamic from connection to responsibility. The listener may begin to feel like they are being asked to regulate someone else's emotional state, which naturally leads to withdrawal in many cases. Warmth, on the other hand, carries a completely different emotional signal. Warmth communicates openness, care, and human presence without attaching demand to it. It says, "I am here with you," without also saying, "You need to respond in a certain way for me to feel okay." That distinction is subtle but powerful. Warmth invites connection. Neediness demands it. When warmth is combined with neediness, the message becomes conflicted. The words may sound kind, but the emotional tone underneath carries anxiety. This creates inconsistency in how the message is received. The recipient senses both affection and pressure at the same time, which can lead to confusion or emotional distancing. People tend to feel safest in interactions that are emotionally congruent, where tone and message match. When they don't match, the nervous system often trusts the tone over the words. This is why tone often matters more than message. It reveals what is not being said directly. It shows whether someone is grounded or unsettled, secure or anxious, present or grasping. Even in silence, tone can be felt through timing, pacing, and the emotional rhythm of interaction. Warmth without neediness creates attraction because it produces a rare emotional experience, connection without pressure. In many relational dynamics, especially those involving avoidant tendencies, people are used to experiencing closeness as something that comes with expectations, emotional intensity, or subtle demands. When they encounter warmth that does not carry those expectations, it stands out, it feels lighter, it feels safer. And safety is often the foundation upon which attraction can grow. This does not mean being emotionally distant or cold. It means being emotionally available without emotional dependence. You can care deeply without requiring immediate reassurance. You can express interest without escalating urgency. You can be kind without attaching your stability to the other person's response. When someone operates from this state, their communication naturally changes. Messages become shorter but clearer. Responses are calmer. Silence is tolerated without panic. There is no over-explaining to fix emotional uncertainty. Instead, there is trust in one's own emotional grounding. And that grounding is what gives warmth its strength. Neediness, by contrast, often creates the opposite effect. It compresses emotional space. It makes interactions feel heavier than they need to be. It introduces an unspoken expectation that something must be resolved immediately for emotional relief. Over time, this can lead the other person to feel overwhelmed, even if they initially cared deeply. The key transformation happens internally first. When you are no longer using communication as a tool to manage anxiety, your tone naturally softens. You stop trying to extract reassurance through words. You stop overloading messages with emotional subtext. And you begin to communicate from a place of steadiness rather than urgency. That shift is what changes perception. Because people don't just respond to what you say, they respond to how regulated you feel while saying it. A calm nervous system creates a calm tone. A calm tone creates emotional ease. And emotional ease creates space for attraction to develop without pressure. Ultimately, warmth without neediness is not a technique. It is emotional alignment. It is when your internal state and external expression are in harmony. And in that harmony, communication stops feeling like pursuit and starts feeling like presence. When someone has experienced emotional inconsistency in relationships, hot and cold behavior, unpredictable attention, or sudden emotional withdrawal, the nervous system does not simply forget that pattern. It learns from it. It becomes more alert, more cautious, and more sensitive to signs of change. So when trust is damaged in this way, it is not rebuilt through big emotional gestures or sudden declarations of care. In fact, intensity often does the opposite. It can feel overwhelming, suspicious, or even unsafe. This is why consistency without intensity is so powerful. It works at the level of emotional regulation rather than emotional persuasion. Consistency means showing up in a steady, reliable way over time. It means your presence does not fluctuate wildly based on mood, reaction, or external validation. There is no emotional unpredictability attached to your behavior. The other person begins to learn, consciously or unconsciously, that your energy is stable. But what makes this especially important is the absence of intensity. Intensity often carries emotional spikes, strong expressions of feeling, urgent attempts to reconnect, or emotionally charged conversations designed to fix distance quickly. While intensity can feel passionate in the moment, it does not always communicate safety to a nervous system that has been conditioned by instability. Instead, it can resemble the same emotional volatility that created distrust in the first place. So, when consistency is paired with low intensity, something very different happens. The nervous system is no longer being pushed into emotional extremes. It is not being pulled into highs and lows. Instead, it is experiencing something unfamiliar in many relational patterns: predictability. Predictability is one of the foundations of emotional safety. When someone knows that your tone, your presence, and your responses will not dramatically shift from one moment to the next, they begin to relax internally. This relaxation is not immediate. It builds gradually through repeated experiences. Each calm interaction becomes evidence that the environment is stable. Over time, this stability begins to overwrite earlier emotional uncertainty. The nervous system starts to update its expectations. Instead of preparing for emotional disruption, it begins to anticipate steadiness. And this shift is where trust begins to rebuild, not as an idea, but as a felt experience. Importantly, consistency without intensity does not mean emotional absence. It does not mean being cold, detached, or unresponsive. It means removing volatility while maintaining presence. You are still engaged, still available, still human, but you are not amplifying emotions to force closeness or resolution. You are allowing connection to develop at a pace that does not overwhelm the other person's internal system. This approach also protects your own emotional stability. When you are not relying on intense expressions to create reassurance, you are less likely to experience emotional burnout or disappointment. You are not constantly escalating emotional energy to maintain connection. Instead, you are building it slowly and steadily through behavior that is aligned with emotional regulation rather than reaction. For someone who has been used to unpredictability, this kind of consistency can initially feel unfamiliar. They may even test it, withdraw slightly, or wait for emotional escalation that never comes. But if consistency continues without intensity, the system begins to recalibrate. What once felt uncertain begins to feel safe enough to stay present in. This is how trust is rebuilt in a deeper sense. Not through convincing someone that you are trustworthy, but through demonstrating it repeatedly in small, stable ways. The nervous system does not respond to arguments or explanations. It responds to patterns. And when the pattern is calm, steady, and non-reactive, it slowly begins to lower its defenses. Ultimately, consistency without intensity shifts the entire emotional landscape of a relationship. It removes chaos without removing connection. It replaces unpredictability with reliability. And in that reliability, trust is not forced. It is gradually restored through experience, not expectation. When people go through emotional disconnection or uncertainty in relationships, it is very easy for the focus to narrow down into one outcome, getting the other person back. Thoughts become organized around repair, reversal, and restoration of what was lost. Every action, every message, and every moment of reflection can start to orbit around the question, how do I make them return? But this focus, while understandable, often creates emotional instability rather than resolution, because it ties your internal state to something you cannot fully control. The deeper shift happens when the goal is no longer about winning someone back, but about becoming emotionally unshakable. This is not indifference, and it is not emotional detachment. It is a state of internal steadiness where your sense of self is not dependent on someone else's proximity. attention, or responsiveness. It is the ability to remain grounded even when external emotional conditions are uncertain. When your focus is on winning someone back, your emotional system becomes reactive. You begin to monitor behavior closely. Silence feels like rejection. Delayed responses feel like danger. Small changes in tone can feel amplified. This creates a cycle where your nervous system is constantly adjusting to external signals rather than remaining anchored internally. And in that state, emotional clarity becomes harder to access. But when the goal shifts toward emotional unshakability, the direction changes entirely. Instead of trying to influence the other person's behavior, you begin to regulate your own emotional responses. You stop centering your stability around outcomes you cannot guarantee. You begin to rebuild your internal foundation, which may have been weakened by anxiety, attachment stress, or emotional inconsistency. Emotional unshakability does not mean you do not feel. It means you are not easily destabilized by what you feel. You can experience longing without collapsing into desperation. You can experience uncertainty without spiraling into panic. You can experience distance without losing your sense of self. There is emotional space between stimulus and reaction, and in that space you regain choice. This shift also changes how you relate to the other person. When you are not trying to win them back, your communication naturally becomes less pressured. There is no hidden urgency behind your words. There is no emotional bargaining embedded in your tone. You are no longer trying to create a specific outcome through intensity. Instead, you are interacting from a place of calm presence, regardless of what the outcome may be. Ironically, this is often when relational dynamics begin to change. Not because emotional unshakability is a strategy to influence the other person, but because it transforms the emotional energy you bring into the interaction. Neediness, fear, and urgency tend to contract connection. Stability, calmness, and groundedness tend to expand it. People feel the difference, even if they cannot always articulate it. However, the real purpose of becoming emotionally unshakable is not relational. It is internal. It is about no longer abandoning yourself in the pursuit of someone else. It is about reclaiming emotional authority over your own life. When your inner world is stable, external events no longer define your worth or your direction. You can still care deeply, but you are no longer controlled by the emotional highs and lows of uncertainty. This does not mean you stop valuing relationships. It means relationships no longer become the source of emotional survival. You begin to relate from wholeness rather than lack, from stability rather than fear, from choice rather than compulsion. And in that state, something important happens. You become less reactive and more intentional. You respond rather than chase. You observe rather than panic. You engage without losing yourself in the outcome. This is what emotional unshakability looks like in practice. Not perfection, but grounded presence. Ultimately, the transformation is not about whether someone returns or not. It is about whether your emotional world collapses in their absence or remains intact. When you become emotionally unshakable, you are no longer living inside the emotional turbulence of uncertainty. You are standing in your own center, and from that center, every connection you choose becomes clearer, calmer, and more aligned with who you are.